Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. This is Dan Lizette. This is episode 117. This episode is brought to you by listeners like you, those who have chosen to support the Podcast Digest on Patreon with my forever gratitude. There's a link in the show notes if you'd like to support the Podcast Digest directly for as little as $1 a month. The Podcast Digest this week is also brought to you by Podbean. It is podcast hosting and monetization that will work for you. It's the easiest way to start podcasting. If you go to podbean.com/TPD, you'll learn more and you'll get your first month free. I'll tell you more about Podbean in just a little while. But on to this week's show, folks. I'm really excited about this conversation. It was great to talk to my guest this week. I've been a huge fan, as many of you know, of sort of the true crime, or more appropriately, investigative journalism type podcast, and I've featured many and have been very fortunate to talk to some of the great hosts and producers who have put some of these wonderful shows out, and this week's episode fits squarely into that category. My guests this week were the host and producer of Accused from the Cincinnati Enquirer. Amber Hunt and Amanda Rossman were the two journalists who were basically primarily responsible for this amazing podcast and this amazing story of this murder from 1978. And it is an amazing tale, not just the murder, but the investigation and the fallout of what's happened in all these waning years. I cannot suggest to you more to subscribe and check out this show if for some reason you have not done so. If you have, I hope that this conversation gives you a little bit of insight behind what the almost year-long process that Amber and Amanda went through to deliver this show that I find so intriguing and had me Googling while I was listening and asking questions and digging more into this phenomenal story. I hope that you enjoy this interview, and I don't want to delay any further. So let's get straight to my conversation with Amber Hunt and Amanda Rossman from the Cincinnati Enquirer. All right, folks, and as I mentioned up front, my guest this week, I'm very excited to be joined by two journalists from the Cincinnati Enquirer who worked on the Accused podcast. One of my favorite shows. You guys have probably noticed I've been featuring a lot of sort of the true crime or investigative journalism shows, and in that sort of genre, Accused is one of the best out there. So it's my privilege to welcome to the Podcast Digest both Amber Hunt and Amanda Rossman. Welcome, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me, and I'm really excited to talk about the show because I imagine I'm going to try to wear the hat of all the thousands of listeners who've listened along with this and try to ask a bunch of the questions. I'm sure they also were yelling at their phones when listening, so I'll do my best. But before we jump into that, I'd like folks to get to know a little bit about the two of you. So who wants to go first?
I can go first. I'm Amber Hunt. I've worked here at the Enquirer for about 3 years, I think, and I've been a journalist for 20 years, which is kind of crazy. I have always been drawn to crime coverage, so I covered crime in Detroit for about 8 years. I've written 3 true crime books, and then for some reason I wrote a book on Kennedy women called The Kennedy Wives. So I kind of keep busy. I shoot photos on the side, and I really like to dig into stories. So that's the personality trait that made this project come to life, I guess.
And Amanda?
Yeah, I've been with the Enquirer for, a little over 10 years now, and basically started kind of right out of college. I am a local girl from Cincinnati. Went to Northern Kentucky University where I studied journalism and minored in photography. And been with the Enquirer for, 10 years now, and been diving into photos and video, doing a lot of video recently. And I don't know if you saw some of the video components for Accused, but on our website we have videos, we have lots of photos to go with the story too.
Yeah, there's a lot of elements of what today in preparation, I just read through the whole print version of the story as well. And I didn't even know that existed until I was just sort of clicking around today. There's a print version, there's videos, there's photos, there's the podcast. You guys have done so much work with this, but I'm really curious. Obviously, we all know about what Serial sort of did to the world of podcasting, but I'm curious, between the two of you and the Inquirer, what was sort of the origin story of Accused?
Well, one of the lawyers you hear in the podcast, named Debbie Leiden, she brought the case to another lawyer who happens to represent the Inquirer in Media Matters. So he's the guy who's always fighting when we're filing the FOIAs and stuff, the Freedom of Information Act requests. So she just kind of mentioned it to him as, I'm working on this, and I think I'm to the point where it might be beneficial to have a reporter look at it. He didn't, he's in no position to assign anything and would never go that route, but he did think it was an interesting story. So he mentioned it to our executive editor, who mentioned it to one of our editors, and she asked me to look into it. And all of this is to say, it started as basically like possibly one story, maybe a Sunday front page story if I dug in deep enough and found anything interesting. But we were looking at it originally as just, another good story idea that comes up, as they do. It ended up that there were so many twists and turns to it that we started to think, well, maybe that's not the best way to tell this specific story. And we started to have meetings, and I said, Serial kind of showed us that there is an audience out there for true crime. Maybe we'll do a few stories, and we'll have some podcast element as, sort of a supplemental thing. But once we started to really dig into creating that podcast component, we realized that that was the best way to tell the bulk of the story. And so that became the focus. So we did the podcast, the 8 episodes, and then right after that wrapped up, the 10,000 word print version came out. So it was a really kind of a slow evolution.
And was this something that you had to convince the Inquirer, or when you guys went and said, hey, this might be best delivered in podcast form, were they immediately supportive, or was this something you guys sort of had to talk them into?
This never happens, this kind of setup. I can't tell you how crazy lucky we've been, because we came in, we said, maybe we should do a podcast component. And because we had done some reporting by then, we could say why we thought, we found that the prosecutor involved is still in the county, and, we're able to sell the story a bit. So they were always like, oh, okay. All right. Yeah, that sounds fine. And then it just kept growing and growing. And the whole time okay, well, if that's what it needs, that's a really unusual position to be in. So we've been very, very fortunate and grateful the whole time.
Had the Inquirer done anything else previously with podcasts?
I think they've done a few sports-related podcasts, but nothing of this nature.
No, this was a first. Yeah, it was a really crazy endeavor to take on.
How about,
if we had known how much work, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but if we had known at the beginning how much work it would have been, I'm sure we would have had a harder time selling it. But because it just kept growing incrementally, we were able to be like, well, if we just do a little bit more, and if we just do a little bit more, and they let us.
So how about either of you personally, any experience in podcasts explicitly, or just sort of in other related medium that had some transferable skill?
I don't think either one of us have done anything related to podcast. I've edited video, so I'm kind of used to editing audio. So that's as far as I knew going into this.
And for me, I had been interviewed on one podcast for one of my true crime books. And I had been interviewed on Dateline and stuff as one of those talking head journalists telling you that, so I was split in. And that actually was better experience than I would have thought. But in terms of no, and I was absolutely sure that everybody would hate my voice, and that I was, a detriment more than a help, but that I was just going to do my best. So yeah, it was all new to us.
Well, in the end, I don't think that was the case, Amber. That's for sure. I thought your narration was wonderful. I thought the narration piece was one of the highlights for me as a listener. But so the two of you realized there may be a podcast here, but neither of you have any direct podcast experience. How do you guys get this process started?
We listened to a lot. I think we kind of figured out what we liked, what works, what we didn't like. Just kind of went from there.
Well, and we're in this weird position right now where in newsrooms across the country, we have had to adopt new skills for the past decade, So I, as a reporter, I really do shoot photos on the side. I fell in love with it, doing it for my own stories because of staffing issues, So you're basically told, like, well, you have to do more. You need to know how to take photos. You need to know how to make little videos. So the idea of us tackling a new skill, I mean, that's just an extension of what we've been having to do so much anyway. So while it was daunting, it was in line with the mindset we've had to adopt.
You mentioned sort of the changing newsrooms. I want to take a quick tangent. I'm not sure if either of you heard my conversation. 2 weeks ago, I spoke with Madeline Barron from APM and In the Dark, another great investigative journalism podcast.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, and her and I took a little tangent at the beginning of the conversation, and I sort of want each of yours take on this as well. We sort of lamented the fact that so many investigative journalists and the funding from, be it newspapers or websites or mediums, tend to be going down, and people are not necessarily pursuing this as much as we would all like to see. What's both of your take from being participants in investigative journalism on where we stand and maybe where we're going with this?
You want to start, Amanda? You want me to?
I'll let you start with that one.
So I think we've seen it shrink a lot in newsrooms. We've seen investigative become harder to tackle because the staffing is so sparse. But I'm actually really optimistic that projects like ours succeeded. They've been succeeding because I think it's showing that if you invest the time and the manpower and all of that, and you create a good product, good journalism, people will follow. I mean, we've had 3.5 million listeners so far, which is insane. Like that's
wonderful.
We're just in Cincinnati. Our circulation is, I don't know, it's less than 200,000, I think. So that kind of reach is unheard of for a daily newspaper. But we were able to show like it's the journalism. So if you invest in doing it properly, the audience will follow, and we can be kind of a case study in that. So I really am very optimistic. I'm also optimistic in that, post-election there's been some emphasis put on the need for investigative journalism and the importance of journalism in a democracy. And, maybe we had to stumble and screw around just covering too many, chicken dinners for people to realize that that's not the best use of their local reporters. And there's a lot of stuff to dig into and suss out, and that's what we need to be doing. So I'm hoping that that's going to start trending that way.
And Amanda, what's your take?
I think we're on the same page here. I think people are starting to see that, not that they weren't noticing a need for it before, but with everything happening these days, it's important to, note the free press and the amount of time that these stories take. It's worth it.
And then if you think about it too, we really, this is such a unique story because the case had been sealed. There was nobody else who was going to find this. So if we didn't do it, if somebody hadn't buckled down to do this one, this story would have gone untold. And there are a lot of issues that, I think we were able to raise through our reporting. And if you extrapolate that and you think, okay, well, they found this just by chance by adopting this case. Well, how much is hidden elsewhere? I mean, we've got to we've got to be able to dig for that. And sometimes the dig's going to be fruitless, but that's our job. That's what we're supposed to do, is try and figure out what's going on and tell these stories. So,
Right. It takes time to go knock on a door rather than just waiting for that email or, to keep diving deeper and deeper. It does take time. But, I mean, as we see the result, it's worth it.
And I would think that things like Making a Murderer, Serial, or The Jinx, and all these sort of high-profile things are creating an audience that wants more of these type of stories, not just from an entertainment standpoint, but for those unsolved cases, for those questionable verdicts to be examined or re-examined, because they have seen these other instances where maybe the conclusion wasn't necessarily the right one, and they want and need wonderful investigative journalists to be able to do what they do best to bring this story out.
Well, and it's really interesting because I write the true crime books, and they won't even really consider a case that I pitch if it doesn't have an ending. So the idea that you aren't pretty darn sure, you might not have a trial completed yet, but you at least have somebody charged. They don't like in that genre for things to be unfinished. In the podcast world, well, we did hear from some people who are like, oh my gosh, we don't know who did this at the end of it all. We're still hearing there's much more tolerance for the ambiguity, and there's more understanding with we're putting this out there in hopes of finding the answer.
And it's almost helpful, right? It's almost one of the best ways you could sort of bring in. You mentioned the listenership, right? Anyone now who could have potentially been anywhere near the potential, or the crime scene, or known any of these people you interviewed or talked to, may now come forward. There's another one out of Rochester, New York, that I talked to, Veronica Volk from the show Finding Tammy Joe, and it was very much similar, trying to discover what happened on this murder all these years ago, and they are still getting tips and calls and emails, especially after the release of the podcast.
Right,
Exactly.
that was our biggest hope. Going into this is what we were hoping for, releasing so much information that it would get to the right ears, that it would, we would be able to find people that we couldn't originally find.
Yeah, because it is a very small world now. That's a cliche, but on top of that being a truth, this was also a college town. Those people are not, a big chunk of them are no longer in our readership area. So if we had just done this as a straight print story, I mean, maybe the web version would have been shared a bit, but we've reached far more people this way than we would have been able to otherwise.
Well, I'm sorry for that side tangent there, but those things really interest me. But I
could talk about the industry until I pass out. That's no problem.
As you guys probably noticed, and anyone who listens to the show noticed, I'm a huge fan of this genre. And between the number of shows I've featured and the hosts and producers I've talked to, and it is really intriguing to me because I am just the slackest podcast host in the world. I get to go down to my basement and talk for an hour to awesome folks doing awesome work, but the work that goes into one of these shows is extraordinary, and that's the thing I really like to shine a light on, so that the investigative journalism piece of this can be even more appreciated, is my hope. And that sort of leads to my next question, which is, I wanted to get into the nuts and bolts on how this starts to get put together. First of all, was it just the two of you, or were there others involved as well?
We were heavy lifters. We did end up recruiting some help toward the end, but as we were starting, it was just the two of us. So the way it worked out, it was actually really pretty labor intensive at the start too, because I had to learn how to write for broadcast. I know in theory what you're supposed to do, but when you're actually sitting down to script something out, it's a completely different writing style. So we had done a draft of episode 1, and it was pretty clunky, right, Amanda?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and
it was very short too.
It was short. It was clunky. It was devoid of some of the personality and like the insight that we tried to ultimately infuse. So we would record in a makeshift studio at the newsroom, and we learned how terrible that audio was. It was awful. You could hear cars outside, even though we had, tried to block all that. So, but it allowed us to do drafts. So we would do a draft. Amanda would piece it all together as the producer, and then I would go back through, rewrite it. We would re-record it. She would listen to it. She would try and get me to say, she'd say, maybe you should spend a little bit more time talking about X or Y. And then once we had the drafts in the shape that we wanted them, we actually rented studio space from the local public radio because we didn't have anything, it turned out, suitable in our newsroom. And then, but we had already done like all the mixing by then. Like we knew the order of things, and we did recruit somebody to help with the music too. We ended up hiring a composer, which was really a neat experience to like go back and forth. Oh, I think I'd like this to be a little more, melodic, or this more crescendo or whatever. So it was much more labor intensive than we realized it would be.
And Amanda, what was it like putting the pieces together? Was this, I guess, field reporting, right? You guys were going to these people's houses, their living rooms, sitting down there with recorders. What was that process like for you?
Most of the in-person interviews I also recorded for video. So I just extracted the audio from those interviews. But as far as mixing, it was, you're telling a story. It's kind of like writing for print. So you see it all put together, but in audio form. So you get to listen to it. And I think it just feels so much stronger because you get to hear it out of these voices, you hear these voices. So it's more than just the story, but it was a task in itself because it's not something I've ever done before, just piecing together all these audio components and making sure Amber slows down in her talking.
Because I need to. That was like the biggest note. Like, okay, breathe. Okay, can you slow it down?
Like, that's a lot of information. Can you just slow it down? Yeah.
Hey folks, let me interrupt the conversation just for a quick moment and tell you about this week's show sponsor. It's Podbean. Podbean is podcast hosting and monetization done right. I've been telling you about them for a couple of weeks now, and if you haven't gone ahead and gone to podbean.com/TPD, you're missing out. That's where you can learn a whole bunch more and get your first month of hosting free with Podbean. Let me tell you a little bit about what you'll find if you hop on over to that URL. Podbean's going to offer your show, an existing one or a new one you're thinking about launching, a website that's just like a blog. It's got customizable themes and colors. When you publish an episode, you're going to be able to share that automatically to social sites. You're going to have an embeddable player that appears on that social site that to play your episode. You can even integrate Podbean services into your own website if you've already got one of those. Of course, all your RSS and iTunes support to import or redirect your show if it's existing already. You can create an app. Popular mobile applications are available for both Android and iOS. Podbean, of course, features an online directory, all kinds of promotional opportunities for your show, including some integrated monetization tools that I find really interesting. You can potentially make episodes premium content. It offers an advertising platform, even its own patron program, not to mention the feature I love to talk about all the time, which are comprehensive podcast statistics available for your show, each episode, how it's performing, who's listening, and all the data you could possibly want regarding the performance of your show. Podbean has so much to offer, and I strongly encourage each and every one of you to check it out if you're a host or considering starting. Again, go to podbean.com/TPD to learn more and get your first month free. My thanks to Podbean for sponsoring the Podcast Digest. Now, back to the show. One of the questions I had on my list here, Amber, about that narration was, that at one point, and I could not tell you the exact episode, it was in the latter probably 2 or 3, I think, when you were, and I don't want to get, for anyone who's wondering why I'm not getting into the nuts and bolts of the story, because basically I want you to go subscribe and listen, okay? I'll touch on a few of them here, but at the point when you were sort of kind of looking for the evidence, if you will, trying to run that down and figure out where it went, it almost sounded like there was an element of exasperation in your voice, Amber, as you were going through it. Was that sort of planned or just really authentic?
Oh, no, you heard that right.
No, that's very authentic.
No, it's funny because even though I was recording, obviously, and I was aware I was recording, I've been doing this for so long, I don't really think that much about what I'm doing. So my interviews, those were how I interview, you know. I wouldn't, it's like it's second nature now. I wouldn't be able to change that up really if I wanted to. The goal, the journalism part always stayed the same. So I've always kind of worn certain things on my sleeve anyway. If somebody is heartbroken in front of me and I'm tearing up, I don't hide it. I make a point to be human with people who are sharing their stories with me. And in that particular episode, I was just pissed. I was getting tired. I mean, I had laryngitis at one point. It really was as exhausting as it sounded. And in truth, we cut out a lot because it would have just been boring as hell for you to hear every phone call that we made on that front.
And, you know, I think, to be honest with you, this is just me. I think that was probably, from a narration standpoint, from a, you know, writing the story standpoint, probably my favorite. And the things that we're talking about, that exasperation and that tone of voice coming through, is what I think sets Accused apart from other shows that doesn't just walk the 50-50 middle, because ultimately you're taking listeners on sort of a journey and a ride, and people start getting invested in this story. I was Googling while I was listening to kind of get backstory of what was happening here. And you end up enunciating what so many listeners are probably already feeling. So I think it's great that it's there. That's just my personal opinion on it.
Well, thank you. And it's funny, you know, if we got any pushback or criticism, we got a lot of praise, which is awesome. But of course, sometimes the criticism stands out to you more. And some of it was, you know, that I was too close to it and I was biased. But to me, it was like, it was like having the opinion that cancer is bad. Like, how can you not want this case solved? I'm not crossing any journalistic integrity line by saying this case deserves to be solved. Any human being who's gone through what this family's gone through deserves to have somebody listen to them and take their case seriously. And so all of that, you don't always hear or see in writing that journalists get exasperated, but it's, of course, it's part of the process. I mean, we wouldn't be in this business if we didn't care.
Right.
And I would think that this is, the reason I think that it's all valid is that I think this is different than news. And tell me if either of you feel differently. This isn't necessarily a news story. I know there was a print version and there's some news elements, but in the end, you are bringing out the story of this family who lost their daughter, or, you know, the Bob Young, who was, you know, accused, wrote the confession, and then ultimately exonerated, and so on and so forth. And it's their stories. It's a personal telling of this horrible situation, and I think that transcends news per se. I
think that more news should be that encompassing. So I would love for down the road for that not to seem like it's more the news. I mean, I think especially with the newsroom shrinking, like, we really need to dig in and explain what the impact of this stuff is and what the human cost is, and make people empathize. You know, I'm not a stenographer. I'm supposed to analyze and make people feel something. That probably sounded cheesy, but I'm sticking my landing on it.
Amanda, was there a time in this process where either of you uncovered something or heard somebody retell something and it sort of shift the direction of the narrative for a future episode?
Well, the more we dug in, the more we decided that there needed to be more episodes. When we first started this, we thought there would be probably 6 episodes, but then we kept finding out more, and we kept talking to more people, and it just kept growing. As far as revelations or anything, we didn't get a hold of one person we really, really needed to talk to and get that later comment until right at the end of our reporting. So that was one thing that our editor made us stick our landing on and say, no, you have to track this guy down. I think you can kind of get an idea of who I'm talking about.
I think was this the in the elevator post press conference?
Yes. Yeah.
I have vision of you just running down the hall like.
I am not an ambush. Yeah, exactly. I am not the kind of reporter who shows. I've just never been into that sort of thing where I'm like, "Ooh, gotcha," and ambushing people. But you have an obligation as an elected official to answer reporters' questions because we're asking them on behalf of the people who pay your salary and put you in office. So there was a point. I was just really happy that because we didn't know he would be at that event. I was really happy he was there because that kept me from having to show up at his doorstep, and I really didn't want to do that. So
right.
Yeah, that worked out.
And then there is another part of this investigation where we think people know everything that we know or know the stories. And there's one point during Amber's interview with Hallie where she reveals some information that Hallie didn't know. And I think that took us a minute to be like, okay, let's process. And we had to gauge her response on a few things, but there was quite a few revelations during this where we were like, oh, that's a pretty big deal.
Well, and one of the biggest reasons the episode count grew is because we tried to reach people that we were told were unreachable, and we reached them. So once we had gotten their voices, obviously we needed time to tell their stories too. And I mean, that was a surprise because I am just a reporter in a newsroom. I don't expect that my investigative skills surpassed the local police. So when they told me that I wouldn't be able to find people, I didn't give up, but I also kind of assumed they were right, and they were not.
I'll tell you, I'm not a journalist in any sense of the word, just an avid listener of these type of podcasts and stories, and it seemed that the two of you had a relentlessness about finding those people that were difficult to find or running down the evidence like we were discussing earlier. This is probably an unanswerable question, but is there any way to put in terms of hours what type of effort was it? How long was this project? Let's start there.
The first email I have was September 30th, 2015, and we debuted September 8th. So really, by the time the episodes were all out, it had been a solid year. We
made our first trip to Oxford right around Christmas time last year.
Right. And then in terms of this was such a unique experience that we ended up being okay with doing a lot of stuff on our own time, not because they asked us to, but because we cared so much about the project. Like if we had asked, if we'd put in the hours, they would have been like, oh, yeah, sure. But everything I was doing centered around this case. Every book I read was connected to late 70s serial killers or other things around Ohio at that time. So you can't really quantify all of that, in a clean way. So, I mean, if a normal work week is 40, I would say we were at least doing 60 or 70, right?
Right. Just trying to get background and just trying to piece together all the pieces of information that we could find. I mean, we were texting each other right before bed most nights with something that we would just find out or making sense of something.
So pretty much all encompassing.
Yeah, it really was.
Pretty much is, yeah.
So that answer my next. This was not this was a fully supported. This was the totality of your day jobs, if you will, by and large during this time. You weren't expected to manage other stories at the same time.
For
on
the most
whole,
part, there were a few times that we would get pulled off for bigger news stories, but I think I was solely doing this from February on, and then Amber was a little bit before me for sure.
Which, I mean, what a huge risk. And I know, like, I'm not the type to kiss up to bosses, so I'm not saying this for their benefit, but it's an enormous risk that they took. They've got this reporter who's never done podcasting going, hey, maybe we should do a podcast. And they said, okay, and then let me not do anything else for almost a year. Like, it was a huge leap of faith. And so, of course, like, we're just really, really grateful that it paid off.
I think it probably also speaks to those higher ups' faith in what they thought the two of you could ultimately produce. And obviously, with those type of numbers you're talking about, they're obviously very happy they made this decision, I'm sure.
They're happy. I'm happy. I feel very, I don't get sappy about bosses, but I feel very, I feel a lot of loyalty at the moment. So.
Right.
Was this, it's had to be for both of you in your careers and prior experience somewhere near the top in terms of time, effort, and energy, yes?
This is the top for me, for sure.
Straight up top. I've written 4 books, and this was by far the deepest dive I've ever done and the most committed I've ever been to one single project. Not that I was lackadaisical on the others, but this one just... every time we turned around, we found something new. So, and you know, I think there was something to being in a partnership on this one because I didn't want to let Amanda down. And we had decided early on that, you know, this was a complete partnership. So, you know, when I would start to flag, I would feel an obligation to get myself up going again because I didn't want to let her down.
And Amanda, I'm sure you felt the same way, yes?
She hates me.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
She hates me.
Yeah.
Now the truth comes out. She just actually hates me.
She put me to sleep like 4 times editing her audio. No.
It's like, just text me. I don't want to hear your voice anymore. Just text me.
Yeah. I was like, do you hate me yet? Do you hate me? It's okay. You hate me.
Another topic I want to ask, when I was asking earlier about sort of, was there any eye-opening moments? Most people probably will recognize as soon as they hop into this that a lot of what Accused is an investigation into the investigation of the job done by the police departments, sheriff departments, detectives, etc. I had to imagine that at a time or two, did either of you just throw your arms up at some point and be like, this is how this was done, really?
I think that happened just about every day.
Yeah.
And we would uncover something. We'd be like, really? You didn't note that? Where's the file on this? What is happening?
And it's not because I dismiss them as not, you know, being well-intentioned or anything, but there were some things done where, you know, a script written by a high schooler wouldn't have missed that part of police work. So, yeah, it got frustrating.
But even as far as the evidence goes, which we all know what happened to it, or we don't know what happened to it, frankly. But looking at the evidence list, they took a table, but they didn't take the contents that were on the table. So it's like, what are you doing? And,
why wouldn't you take the cup that was on the table?
There are so many times.
It's an amazing story. That's what I was doing as a listener. I'm like, are you kidding me? You know, nobody knows where this stuff is, or they didn't talk to that person, or you know. And there were so many, like and again, I'm not trying to give stuff around, but the individual they just discredited out of hand after he volunteered his story, and you're like, really? It's like, how
you don't think it's important to talk to him again, really? Yeah.
Does it affect your opinions on potentially future stories that come down the pipeline, or your own personal opinion about police departments and detectives?
Well, luckily, I am coming at this from a place where I have done a lot of police reporting. Number one, if I had done this 10 years ago, I would have been, you know, I mean, I'm sure in 10 years from now, I'll think I'm an idiot now. Well, 10 years ago, I was definitely an idiot. So I wouldn't have been able to tackle this the same way. But on top of that, in the interim, I have worked with amazing law enforcement officers. I think at this point I feel fairly confident that I can suss out the thorough from the not. So I will always push back because that's my nature and that's my job. I will always say, okay, well, you think that it's this way, but what's the proof and what did you do to substantiate that? But I know that I'm at least coming from a place where I absolutely know that there are amazing police officers out there, and I've seen them solve impossible crimes. So I'm not totally jaded. At the same time, I see things a little differently when I hear about, say, a confession. I'm going to be much more cautious about accepting that as being proof of anything.
And how about you?
What about you, Amanda?
Yeah.
Well, I had a good friend of mine who was a police officer kind of near the Oxford area listen as it was all coming out, and it made me feel better about some of the points that he was bringing up to me as he was listening, and knowing that he would do things differently, or certain things were being said and he was like, why did they not do this? Or, so it does give me hope that there are good police out there. There are police that know what they're doing. And I mean, there are good police in the Oxford Police Department. As we just want to know that something's being done now.
Yeah, I don't expect perfection from anybody in any field. And it's really easy to analyze something down the road. I don't want to act like I've got some great, insight. But I also want to feel like the people who are in charge with investigating this important stuff can recognize that they could be wrong sometimes.
Right.
From a feedback standpoint, and we can start there with maybe the officials in Oxford or any other local law enforcement, what's the feedback been since the episodes have come out? Now, the whole season is there. Starting with any official feedback. Anybody reach out to you guys with any comments?
Nope.
Stone cold silence. Wow.
Yeah. No, I mean, to the point where I've had people contact me, say, I heard the podcast. I was there in 78. I have some information that might be of use to you, and I pass it along to the police, and they do not respond to me at all.
Wow.
Yeah. I don't know what that's about. So I'm just going to keep doing my job and hope that they're doing theirs.
Do you think the department feels ashamed of what happened? Also, because many of the people have turned over now, I assume.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. There's new administration in that department now. I do still believe that those around that were involved in this case still wholeheartedly believe that it was Bob. And
it's amazing. I think the thing that really worries me about that is it almost seems like they just want to check the box, cross it off the list, and move on. Put it in the done pile is what I kept thinking. They don't want to undo it and relook at it and have another thing on their docket that they thought was already solved.
That's exactly what I think should scare people.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, I don't get that. I second guess myself all the time in terms of, was that the right choice, or am I being biased, and so I just don't understand why you can't think that you could have made a mistake. I don't get it.
And it's really scary because if you have to assume that if this mentality was rampant in this department, that it exists elsewhere. And if the concept of coming to any conclusion is more important than the right conclusion, then we've all got a bigger problem on our hands, I imagine.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the nice things about this format, and, that we were allowed to be open-ended, that we didn't have somebody like, a publisher for one of my books say, yeah, but people aren't going to like that. It's not closed yet. I mean, that's part of the point here, is that when you make these decisions, things don't close. You just because you mark it's done on a piece of paper doesn't mean that it's actually over.
Don't you think it's possible, too, that maybe, I hope this is the case, with all those listeners, to Accused, or even go further, be it Serial or In the Dark or Finding Tammy Jo, all these wonderful shows, that people now, if they, hopefully not, but if anyone were to ever find themselves in a similar situation with a loved one or friend or family member, that maybe they do some of that pushing back on the detectives, on the investigators, not to necessarily be a problem, but to make sure that they are not just checking a box.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in every other aspect of life, we're encouraged to take ownership of things. There's big pushes. You go to the doctor, you need to ask certain questions. You can't be embarrassed. And well, all of this is true in police work too. Don't assume, because even if they're great people, they might overlook something.
What about the feedback from the listenership at large? I'm sure you guys have heard a lot from people who've listened. What's the reception been like?
It's been pretty great, I would say. I mean, the podcast community, those listeners who dive into these types of podcasts are really open and are really great and giving good feedback. And I love to hear opinions about the case, and it's nice getting, seeing the comments come in on Twitter and being able to interact with a lot of our listeners that way too.
Yeah, it's been very cool. I mean, I got an email today from a student who said that her entire forensics class was assigned to the podcast, and their like project is to propose who did it and why. And that's just, I mean, that's great to me. I love that. Number one, I love that Beth's name actually circulated, that people know her name, because one of the tragedies in all this was that it happened over Christmas. It was kind of like people in Oxford didn't even know about this case. So that's just I know that helps the family that she's not forgotten. And then too, from a forensic standpoint, like I think there are some things it is worth discussing what went wrong and what technology we have today to avoid, some of the mistakes that were made then. And it's been really heartening. I'm saving all the emails for when I have a bad day.
I was going to say,
that's which is
just feel great.
Pretty much every other day. But
that's got to feel great, because this class now is doing this only because of the practically a year that the two of you spent putting together these interviews, these videos, this audio, the written story. I mean, they're using this really as their course material. That's got to feel great.
Yeah, that's really rewarding. Yeah.
Well, what about from I've never asked this question, but I'm just curious because we've talked about sort of, similar shows in the podcasting space. As newbies to the podcasting world, have you had other podcasters, producers, hosts reach out to the two of you at all?
Yes. Yeah.
We have.
You've been welcomed into the club.
We have. It's a good club to be in, honestly.
No, it's actually kind of surprising. Journalists are awesome, but we're a cranky bunch. And a lot of times, I mean, one of the reasons that Amanda and I were so explicit with each other at the beginning is because egos can get involved. And, so we decided from the beginning, both of our names were going on every aspect of this so that we would never be butting heads on anything. And I'm not big on that anyway. But it was just nice that we were able to work together that way. And sometimes you do well in journalism, and people don't applaud because they're just annoyed that it wasn't them. So in the podcasting community, I've just been amazed, like how embracing it's been. I haven't felt like anybody was nasty toward me, or it's just been really, really nice. So I'm going to move in. This is my new home. Yeah.
I'm just thinking to myself that the two of you need to be on a panel at a conference, kind of with a session going over all this. There are probably dozens and dozens of people in attendance at a conference. I went to Podcast Movement in Chicago this year, and Phoebe Judge and Lauren Spohr from Criminal and Radiotopia had a session I went to that was very much about sort of telling these type of stories. And I think that the two of you would also be able to really sort of have some great insight to give, young budding producers and hosts who want to, maybe do their own piece of investigative journalism.
Well, we'd be happy to.
I know a guy. I'll have him reach out to you. Former guest with Podcast Movement. It's in Anaheim. It's in Anaheim.
We feel a little That's cool. That's cool. No, I think we both have trouble talking about ourselves. You might have noticed that at the start of this interview.
Right.
And we have trouble thinking that we are in a position of expertise, even though this is done well. All we did was record what we do anyway, and then luckily, I'm proud of how we put it together. I don't want to I don't want to denigrate what we've done, but we also don't feel like experts. So, yeah.
Well, that leads perfectly to my last question. Maybe it'll come out better the next time. So, will there be Accused season 2, or is there anything in the works down the line?
What do we say, Amanda?
That you can share at this point.
We're talking about it. We're definitely
we are talking
about it.
I will say that we absolutely, in terms of Beth Andy's case, anything that comes through tip-wise, we're cataloging. I've done several interviews since the podcast wrapped up. I'm hoping that we can share some of that at some point here so that there will, at least be an episode 9.
Right. We're not giving up on Beth's case yet.
No.
So we're still working that out. And as far as the second season, we're still talking about it. I think it's a good possibility, but we're not ready to get it all figured out yet.
One of the beautiful things about this one was that it was the right story. It happened organically, so we don't want to force anything.
Right.
But I honestly really fell in love with the form of storytelling. I think for me, I liked it better than video, and I liked the challenge it presented in terms of writing, and then me having to come back around and provide a completely different take for the print product. I mean, that was a great challenge for me. So I'm a really big fan, and I definitely hope to do more.
Well, I, for one, probably speak for many of those 3.5 million people in hopes that does happen, and that there is, whether it's Accused season 2 or any other, project from the two of you. I'm a huge fan of the work that you put into this particular story, and I imagine a lot of people are. But if for some strange reason somebody's listening to this and they haven't heard Accused yet, can one of you take a minute and tell them where they can find the podcast, these videos, the written story, everything?
Sure, Amber, you want to?
Yeah, so we're at cincinnati.com/accused podcast. That's the landing page. And, this is the one area where the podcast community just ripped me, though, because I said, what'd I say, /
You said backslash. And
I said backslash.
It is actually a forward slash.
Woman.
We'll acknowledge that here, that we know. Yes. We now know what we're talking about.
We now know.
I have made the same mistake myself many, many times. So.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, guys. So, yes, that's the landing page. The podcast is available on SoundCloud, on iTunes. We have Twitter and Facebook pages now, too. We weren't sure that we were going to do that, but we do have both. So you can find us there, and some of the videos and stuff and documents are uploaded there as well.
And I will be sure to have links to all of that in the show notes, as I always do, folks. If you have not done so, I cannot recommend Accused more than I can. I mean, it's a wonderful listen, wonderfully produced, and definitely worth your time. So please go check it out. So Amber Hunt, Amanda Rossman, thank you both very much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you.
And that'll do it, folks. That's episode 117 of the podcast digest. Accused, one of my favorite shows of the year, and I'm really hooked on this genre, and this one is done so well. Please, please, please go check out the work that Amber and Amanda have done, and I think you, like me, will find it pretty amazing listening. Folks, I want to take just a moment and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this conversation, if you enjoy the Podcast Digest, please take just a moment, review the show on iTunes, tweet about it, put it on your Facebook page. Let people know who are getting into podcasting or looking for other things to listen to that the Podcast Digest is where they need to come. I also want to take a minute and thank this week's show sponsor, Podbean. Go to podbean.com/TPD. If you're thinking of starting a podcast or looking for a great home for your existing show, you'll get your first month free if you sign up with the special URL. It tells them you came from the Podcast Digest, and you'll be able to try all of Podbean's great hosting features. My thanks to Podbean once again. And that'll do it for this week, folks. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. I enjoyed putting it together for you. And come back next week. Another great interview, another great conversation. 118 is next. Until then, my name's Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.